The night Mabel Cross collapsed at Wade Holloway's door, half dead from the blizzard, she had no idea the man behind it was Montana's most dangerous cowboy, or that he hadn't spoken to a woman in 6 years. What she did know was simple. He could either save her life or let her freeze 3 feet from his fireplace. But when their enemies discovered a plus-size widow had cracked open the heart of the territory's richest, coldest rancher, they decided to destroy them both. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind didn't howl that night. It screamed. It tore across the Montana plains like something alive and furious, ripping through the skeletal trees surrounding Black Hollow Ranch, shaking the massive lodge until the window panes rattled in their frames. Inside, Wade Holloway sat alone in the great room, staring into a fireplace that threw shadows across his weathered face, but did nothing to warm the ice that had settled into his bones 6 years ago. He didn't look up when the first knock came. It was faint, barely audible over the storm, but it was there. A desperate, uneven thud, thud, thud against the heavy oak door. Wade's jaw tightened. His hand, scarred and calloused from decades of ranch work, tightened around the glass of whiskey he'd been nursing for the past hour. He didn't move. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Boss?" The voice belonged to Garrett, one of the few ranch hands who'd stayed through the winter. The old cowboy appeared in the doorway, snow still clinging to his beard, his eyes wide with something Wade hadn't seen in him before. Concern. "There's someone at the door." "Then tell them to leave." Wade's voice was flat, final. "Boss, it's a woman. She's—" Garrett hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's in bad shape. Real bad." Wade finally looked up. His eyes, gray as the storm outside, fixed on Garrett with the kind of cold intensity that made grown men step back. "Not my problem. She'll die out there." Then she should have picked a better night to travel. For a moment, neither man moved. The fire crackled, the wind shrieked, and somewhere beyond that door someone was freezing to death. Garrett shook his head slowly, something like disappointment crossing his weathered features. "All right, boss. I'll tell her." He turned to leave, then stopped. "But you should know, she ain't begging. She just asked real calm if this was Black Hollow Ranch. When I said yes, she said, then Wade Holloway can decide if he's the kind of man who lets people die on his doorstep." Wade's fingers went still on the glass. "She said that?" Word for word. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Wade set down his whiskey with more force than necessary, the glass hitting the table with a sharp crack. He stood, his 6'3" frame unfolding with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who'd spent years building walls around himself, and who was about to crack one open against his better judgment. "Fine, bring her in, but she's gone the second this storm clears." Garrett nodded and disappeared. Wade stayed where he was, staring into the fire, telling himself this meant nothing, that it was simple decency, nothing more, that he'd let her warm up, dry off, and be on her way before he had to actually see her, speak to her, acknowledge that another human being had crossed the threshold of the fortress he'd built. Then the door opened. The cold hit first, a blast of frigid air that made the fire dance and sent a chill racing through the great room. Garrett stepped inside, and behind him, Wade's eyes narrowed. The woman who stumbled through his doorway wasn't what he expected. She was tall, maybe 5'9", with a frame that society would call too much, and that Wade's brain registered as substantial before he shut down that line of thinking entirely. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, soaked through with melted snow. Her coat, threadbare and obviously too small, hung open because the buttons had long since given up trying to close across her chest and stomach. Her skirt was torn at the hem, caked with ice and mud. Her boots were split at the seams, blood seeping through where the frozen leather had carved into her feet. But it was her face that stopped him cold. She wasn't crying, wasn't pleading, wasn't doing any of the things women usually did when they wanted something from him. She was just looking at him. Her eyes, dark brown, sharp, exhausted, met his without flinching. She took one step forward, swayed slightly, and caught herself on the doorframe with a hand that was purple with cold. "You're Wade Holloway." It wasn't a question. "I am." "Good." Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but steady. Because I need to know if you're going to help me, or if I should save us both the time and just lie down in the snow now. Garrett made a noise that might have been a cough or a laugh. Wade shot him a look that could have frozen the fire solid. The woman didn't seem to notice, or care. She was shaking now. Not from fear, but from the cold working its way through her body, shutting down everything that wasn't essential. Her lips were blue. Her fingers couldn't seem to grip the doorframe anymore. Wade had seen men die of exposure before. He knew the signs. "Garrett, get her by the fire." "Yes, sir." Garrett moved to help her, but she pulled back. Just slightly, just enough to make it clear she didn't want to be touched. She forced her legs to work, forced herself to walk under her own power across the great room toward the fireplace, even though every step looked like it cost her something. Wade watched her, his expression unreadable. She made it 3/4 of the way before her knees buckled. Garrett caught her before she hit the floor, gently, carefully, like she was made of something fragile, even though she clearly wasn't. He lowered her into the chair closest to the fire, and she slumped forward, her whole body shaking so violently now that her teeth were chattering too hard for her to speak. "Get blankets," Wade said. "And hot water. Not boiling. She'll go into shock. Just warm." Garrett disappeared again. Wade stood there 10 feet from the woman in his chair, watching her try to stop shaking through sheer force of will. It wasn't working. The cold had its hooks in too deep. He moved closer, slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. "What's your name?" She looked up at him, her eyes unfocused. Mabel. Mabel Cross." "Where were you headed, Mabel Cross?" "Anywhere that wasn't behind me." "Someone chasing you?" She laughed, short, bitter, ending in a cough that made her whole body convulse. "You could say that?" "Who? Does it matter?" "It does if they're going to show up at my door looking for you." That seemed to get through to her. She straightened slightly, forcing her eyes to focus on his face. "Silas Vane, my dead husband's brother. He took my land, my home, everything I had. And when I wouldn't marry him to make it legal, he—" She stopped, her jaw clenching. "He made sure no one would help me, made sure I had nowhere to go." Wade's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something cold and sharp. "And he's following you." "Not yet. He thinks I'm dead. Or close enough." She pulled the ruined coat tighter around herself, a gesture that did nothing against the cold but everything for her pride. "I walked 2 days in this storm. Lost the horse yesterday. Haven't eaten since—" She trailed off, her eyes drifting shut. "Mabel." Her eyes snapped open. "Stay awake." "I'm trying." Garrett returned with an armful of blankets and a basin of warm water. Wade took them without a word and dismissed him with a sharp nod. The old cowboy hesitated, clearly wanting to help, but knew better than to argue when Wade Holloway gave an order. The door closed. They were alone. Wade crouched in front of her chair, his movements efficient, impersonal. He soaked a cloth in the warm water and pressed it against her hands first, the parts of her that were coldest, most likely to lose circulation. She hissed at the contact but didn't pull away. "This is going to hurt," he said. "Everything hurts. It'll get worse before it gets better. Story of my life." Despite himself, despite everything, the corner of Wade's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something. He worked in silence, warming her hands, then her feet, carefully removing what was left of her boots to reveal skin that was blistered and bleeding and half frozen. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, but tears leaked from the corners of her eyes anyway. Wade pretended not to notice. When the worst of the cold had been chased back, he wrapped her in the blankets, layer after layer until she looked like a cocoon with a face. Then he stood, putting distance between them again. "You'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do with you." Mabel's eyes were already half closed, exhaustion dragging her under now that the immediate danger had passed. But she managed to whisper, "Thank you." Wade didn't respond. He just turned and walked toward the stairs, then stopped with his hand on the banister. "Why Black Hollow Ranch?" Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "Because I heard you don't let anyone in. Figured if I could make it here, maybe Silas wouldn't think to look." "You were wrong about the first part." "Was I?" Wade looked back at her, This woman who'd walked through a blizzard, who'd nearly died on his doorstep, who'd looked him in the eye and refused to beg. Something in his chest shifted. Something he'd thought was frozen solid. "Get some rest, Mabel Cross." He climbed the stairs without waiting for a response, his footsteps heavy on the wood. Behind him, the fire crackled. The storm raged, and in his favorite chair, the one no one else was allowed to sit in, a plus-size widow he'd known for less than an hour fell asleep in his house for the first time in 6 years that anyone other than his ranch hands had done so. Wade reached his room, closed the door, and stood in the darkness. He told himself it didn't matter, that she'd be gone in a day or two, that this was just a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the storm and nothing more. But deep in his gut, in the place where instinct lived, he knew better. The woman downstairs had just changed everything. 3 days later, the storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse, a wall of white that made it impossible to see more than 5 feet beyond the windows, that piled snow against the doors until Garrett and the other hands had to shovel them clear twice a day just to keep the exits accessible. The temperature had dropped so low that the water in the troughs froze solid within an hour of being refilled. No one was going anywhere, which meant Mabel Cross was still there. Wade had spent the first day avoiding her. He'd taken his meals in his office, conducted ranch business from behind closed doors, and made it clear through his absence that her presence was temporary and unwelcome. It worked until the second morning when he came downstairs to find her in his kitchen. Not just in his kitchen, working in his kitchen. She stood at the stove, her back to him, wearing a dress that actually fit her, one of the housekeeper's old things that Garrett must have dug out of storage. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she moved with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of knowing exactly what she was doing. The smell hit him before he could process the scene. Bacon, eggs, fresh bread, coffee so strong it could wake the dead. His stomach growled. Mabel turned, a spatula in one hand, and her eyes met his without surprise, like she'd been expecting him. "Morning," she said simply. Wade's jaw tightened. "What are you doing?" "Making breakfast." She turned back to the stove, flipping something in the pan with practiced efficiency. "Garrett said you usually just eat whatever's cold and fast. Figured since I'm stuck here anyway, might as well make myself useful." "I didn't ask you to." "No, you didn't." She plated the food, generous portions of everything, arranged with more care than Wade had seen in years, and set it on the table. "But I'm not the kind of woman who takes charity without giving something back. So you can either eat this and let me help around the ranch until the storm clears, or you can throw me back outside. Your choice." She said it calmly, matter of fact, like she was discussing the weather and not whether or not Wade was going to let her freeze to death. Wade stared at her. Most women, hell, most people, didn't talk to him like that. They either feared him or wanted something from him or both. They certainly didn't stand in his kitchen, cook his food, and then give him an ultimatum. "You always this stubborn?" he asked. "You always this welcoming?" she shot back. The corner of his mouth twitched again. That same almost smile that had appeared 3 days ago and confused the hell out of him. He sat down at the table. Mabel watched him for a moment, then nodded once, satisfied, and turned back to finish the rest of the meal. Wade picked up his fork, took a bite of the eggs, and stopped. It was good. Better than good. The kind of cooking that required skill and attention and care, things that had been absent from this house for longer than he wanted to admit. He ate in silence. Mabel worked. The kitchen filled with sounds that had been missing for years. The sizzle of food in a pan, the clink of dishes, the quiet hum of someone who was comfortable in their own skin despite what the world thought of them. When Garrett came in for breakfast, followed by 2 more ranch hands, both looking half frozen, they stopped dead at the sight of Wade sitting at the table with a woman moving around his kitchen like she belonged there. "Morning, boys," Mabel said brightly. "Hope you're hungry." The men looked at Wade. Wade didn't look up from his plate. "Sit," he said. They sat. Mabel fed them all. Hot food, strong coffee, enough to sustain them through another brutal day of keeping the ranch running in impossible conditions. The men ate like they'd forgotten what a real meal tasted like. Which, Wade reflected, they probably had. "Ma'am," one of them, a young hand named Cooper, said hesitantly, "This is the best food I've had in, I don't even know how long." Mabel smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. Then you boys need to eat at better places. Ain't no better places out here, ma'am. That's the problem. She laughed at that, a sound that was fuller and richer than her speaking voice, something that seemed too big for the winter morning but filled the kitchen perfectly anyway. Wade found himself listening to it longer than he should have. After breakfast, the men went back out into the storm. Wade retreated to his office. And Mabel started cleaning. Not just the kitchen, the entire house. Wade heard her moving through the rooms below. Heard the sounds of furniture being shifted, floors being scrubbed, windows being washed. He told himself to go down there and tell her to stop, that she was a guest, unwanted, temporary, but still a guest. And she didn't need to work herself to exhaustion. But he didn't. Because the truth was, Black Hollow Ranch had been slowly dying for 6 years. The housekeepers had quit one by one, unable to deal with Wade's cold silences and emptier rooms. The ranch hands did the bare minimum to keep the place functional, and Wade himself had stopped caring about anything beyond the cattle and the land. Now someone was breathing life back into it, and he didn't know how to feel about that. By evening, when he finally emerged from his office, the transformation was startling. The great room gleamed, the floors shone. The windows, previously coated with years of dust and grime, were so clear he could actually see the storm outside. Mabel sat by the fire, mending one of Garrett's shirts with thread and needle she must have found somewhere in the house. Her fingers moved with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. She looked up when Wade entered, but didn't stop working. "I found a lot of broken things," she said conversationally. "Thought I'd fix what I could." Wade poured himself a whiskey, then hesitated. "You want something to drink?" "Water's fine." He brought her water, set it on the table beside her, sat in the chair across from her. Not his usual chair because she'd claimed that one the first night, and he found he didn't mind as much as he should have. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. The storm howled. Mabel's needle flashed in the firelight. "Why are you really here?" Wade asked finally. She didn't look up. "I told you, running from—" "No, I mean here, at Black Hollow Ranch specifically. There are a dozen other places you could have gone, towns with sheriffs, churches with priests, people who'd have actually wanted to help you. Instead, you walked 2 days through a blizzard to reach a ranch run by a man everyone knows doesn't let anyone inside." Her hands stilled. She looked at him then, her dark eyes searching his face. "So I'll ask again, why here?" For a long moment, Mabel didn't answer. Then she set down the shirt and needle, folded her hands in her lap, and spoke with the same quiet honesty she'd shown the night she arrived. "Because I heard you lost someone you loved, that after she died, you shut yourself away and haven't let anyone close since." She paused. "And I thought, maybe a man who understands what it's like to have everything taken from him would understand what that feels like for someone else." Wade's fingers tightened on his glass. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough. I know you let me in when you didn't have to. I know you're letting me stay when you could have thrown me out a dozen times by now, and I know—" Her voice softened. "I know you're not as cold as you pretend to be. You're wrong. Am I?" They stared at each other across the firelight, this broken cowboy and this discarded woman, both carrying scars the world couldn't see. Wade stood abruptly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He walked away before she could respond, before the walls he'd spent 6 years building could crack any further. But as he climbed the stairs to his empty room, he could still hear her voice in his head. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be." And the terrifying part was, he was starting to think she might be right. 1 week into the storm. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping. Mabel had settled into the rhythms of ranch life with an ease that unsettled everyone, Wade most of all. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, organized the supply shed that had been a disaster for 3 years, and somehow managed to make the entire household feel like an actual home instead of just a place where men slept between shifts. The ranch hands loved her. Wade could see it in the way they smiled when she brought them coffee during the afternoon feeding, the way they lingered in the kitchen after meals just to hear her talk, the way Cooper had started bringing her small things, a flower carved from wood, a stone he'd found that was perfectly smooth, like offerings to someone he was half in love with. She treated them all with the same warm kindness. Never flirted, never encouraged anything beyond friendship, but she made them feel seen in a way they weren't used to. And Wade was starting to realize he had a problem. It started with small things. The way his eyes tracked her movement across a room. The way he listened for her voice in the mornings before he came downstairs. The way his chest did something strange and uncomfortable when she laughed at one of Garrett's terrible jokes. He told himself it didn't mean anything, that he was just adjusting to having someone else in the house. That's all. Then came the afternoon he found her in the library. He'd been looking for the ledgers, needed to check some numbers before meeting with his foreman, and stopped dead in the doorway when he saw her. She sat in the window seat, a book in her lap, completely absorbed. The gray winter light caught her profile, softened the edges of her face, made her look almost... Wade shut down that thought before it could finish forming. "Didn't know anyone still used this room," he said. Mabel looked up, startled, then smiled. "Hope you don't mind. I was going through the house and found all these books just sitting here collecting dust. Seemed like a shame." Wade stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves he hadn't looked at in years. He stopped, started again. "Someone used to read in here, a long time ago." Understanding flickered across Mabel's face. She closed the book gently. "I can leave if..." "No." The word came out harder than he meant it to. He softened his tone. "No, it's fine. The room should be used." She studied him for a moment, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Want to sit? I promise not to bore you with book talk." Wade should have said no, should have grabbed the ledgers and left, should have maintained the distance he'd been trying and failing to keep. Instead, he sat. "What are you reading?" She held up the book, Wuthering Heights. Wade's mouth twisted. "Cheerful choice. I like stories about people who refuse to give up, even when the world tells them they should." She ran her fingers over the worn cover. "Even if it destroys them in the end." "You relate to that? Don't you?" The question landed like a punch. Wade leaned back in his chair, studying this woman who seemed to see straight through every defense he'd ever built. "You're dangerous, Mabel Cross." She laughed, that full, rich sound that had become oddly familiar over the past week. "Trust me, I'm the least dangerous person you'll ever meet." "That's not what I meant." Her laughter faded. She looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Then what did you mean?" Wade opened his mouth, closed it. Couldn't find words for the thing twisting in his chest, the feeling that she was pulling apart his carefully constructed isolation, piece by piece, just by being here. He stood. "I need those ledgers." "Wade, get back to your book, Mabel." He grabbed the ledgers from the desk and left before she could say anything else, before he could do something stupid like tell her the truth, that for the first time in 6 years, he was starting to feel something other than cold, and it scared the hell out of him. 10 days. The storm finally broke. The morning dawned clear and bright, the first true sunlight they'd seen in almost 2 weeks. The temperature was still brutal, but the wind had died and the snow had stopped falling, which meant the roads would be passable within a day or two, which meant Mabel could leave. Wade stood at his bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered plains in shades of pink and gold, and told himself this was good news, that getting his life back to normal was exactly what he needed. The hollow feeling in his chest suggested otherwise. Downstairs, he found Mabel already awake, already dressed in her own clothes, the ones Garrett had cleaned and mended as best he could. She stood in the great room, staring out at the clear sky with an expression Wade couldn't quite read. "Storm's over," he said. "I noticed." She didn't turn around. "Guess that means I should probably get moving, figure out where to go next." "You have somewhere in mind?" "Not really." She finally looked at him, and there was something in her eyes. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation. "But I can't stay here forever. You've already done more than anyone had a right to ask." Wade crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What if you did?" "Did what?" "Stay, for a while longer." Mabel's eyes widened. "Wade, the ranch needs help. You've proven you can work, and..." He hesitated, the words foreign on his tongue. "You're good for the men. They work better when morale is high. It's just practical." "Practical," she repeated slowly. "That's what I said." "So you want to hire me? I'm offering you a job. Room, board, fair wages. You help run the household, keep the men fed, manage the things that have been falling apart around here." He met her eyes. And you don't have to run anymore. At least not right away. For a long moment, Mabel just stared at him. Then she shook her head slowly, something like disbelief crossing her face. You're serious? I don't joke. I've noticed. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold this time, but like she was trying to hold something together. Wade, you don't know anything about me. Not really. My past, the people who want to hurt me, the mess I'm dragging with me. I know enough. Do you? Because Silas Vane isn't going to stop looking for me. And when he finds out I'm here, and he will find out eventually, he's going to bring hell down on this ranch. On you. Is that really something you want to deal with? Wade pushed off the doorframe, closing the distance between them. Not too close, he wasn't that far gone yet, but close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. Let me tell you something about men like Silas Vane, he said quietly. They thrive on people being too scared to fight back. They count on their victims running, hiding, staying silent, and they get away with it because most folks would rather look the other way than stand up to them. Exactly. So why would you... I'm not most folks. His voice was flat, certain. And I don't look away. Mabel searched his face, and Wade could see her trying to figure out if he meant it. If he really understood what he was offering. He did. Every word. I can't pay you much, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. If that's what you're worried about, I'm not worried about money. I'm offering you a job because you're damn good at it, and because this ranch runs better with you here than it has in 6 years. The rest of it, Silas, your past, whatever hell comes with you, we'll deal with it when it gets here. Just like that. Just like that. She stared at him for another long moment, and Wade watched 100 emotions flicker across her face. Hope, fear, disbelief, something that might have been gratitude. Then she nodded once. Sharp, decided. All right, I'll stay. Good. He turned to leave, to put distance between them before he said something he couldn't take back, but her voice stopped him. Wade? Why are you doing this? Really? He looked back at her, this woman who'd stumbled into his life in the middle of a blizzard and somehow managed to shake the foundations of everything he'd built. Because you were right, he said. I'm not as cold as I pretend to be. He left her standing there in the morning light, her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open, like he'd just said something she never expected to hear. And as Wade walked away, he realized with something close to terror that letting Mabel Cross stay was either the best decision he'd made in 6 years, or the worst mistake of his life. He just wasn't sure which yet. The weeks that followed moved faster than Wade expected. Mabel didn't just settle into ranch life. She transformed it. Within the first month, she'd reorganized the entire supply system that had been a chaotic mess for years, cutting waste by nearly a third. She noticed which hands worked best together and which ones needed to be kept separate. She started teaching some of the younger men to read during the long winter evenings, using the library that had sat empty for so long. And somehow, without anyone quite noticing how it happened, Black Hollow Ranch stopped feeling like a prison Wade had built for himself. It felt like a home. He watched it happen from a distance, telling himself he was just observing the changes from a business perspective, that Mabel's presence was purely practical, a good investment, nothing more. Then came the morning he found her in the barn, knee-deep in a broken irrigation system that 3 of his best men had given up on. What are you doing? Wade asked, stopping in the doorway. Mabel didn't look up from the tangle of pipes and valves she was elbow-deep in, fixing this disaster before spring thaw turns it into a flood. Garrett said it couldn't be fixed, that we'd need to replace the whole system. Garrett's a fine cowboy, but he doesn't know much about water systems. She grunted, wrenching something loose with more force than he'd expected her to have. My father was an engineer before he died. Taught me how things work, how to take them apart and put them back together. Wade moved closer, watching her work with an efficiency that came from genuine knowledge, not guesswork. Her hands, those same hands that cooked breakfast and mended clothes, moved with absolute certainty through the mechanical guts of the system. Where'd you learn all this? He asked. Told you? My father? He wanted sons, got me instead. Decided if he was stuck with a daughter, he'd at least make sure she could think. She paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of grease across her skin. Of course, most men don't appreciate a woman who knows more than they do about how things work. My husband, She stopped abruptly. Your husband what? Mabel's jaw tightened. She turned back to the pipes, her movements a little too forceful. Didn't matter how much I knew. He married me because his family needed my father's money, and I was stupid enough to think that meant he loved me. When my father died and the money dried up, suddenly I wasn't so appealing anymore. But you stayed married. For a while. Then he died too. She said it flat, emotionless. Fell off his horse drunk. Broke his neck. You sound like you didn't mourn him much. I mourned the man I thought I married. The real one? She shook her head. No. Can't mourn someone who never existed. Wade understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. And then his brother came for your land, he said. Silas? The name came out like poison. He showed up at the funeral with forged papers saying my husband had signed everything over before he died. Said I could either marry him and keep a piece of it or fight him in court and lose everything. So you fought? Of course I fought. I'm not... She stopped, her hands going still on the pipes. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I'm not the kind of woman who just accepts what men tell me I deserve. Something in Wade's chest pulled tight. What happened? He asked. Mabel laughed, but there was no humor in it. What do you think happened? Silas had money, connections, lawyers who could make black look white and up look down. I had nothing but the truth, and we both know how much that's worth in court. She finally looked at him, and the exhaustion in her eyes was older than the weeks she'd been running. I lost everything, the house, the land, even the horse I'd ridden since I was 16. And when I still wouldn't agree to marry him, when I told him I'd rather die than let him touch me, he made sure everyone knew exactly what he thought of me. What do you mean? I mean he spread stories about how I'd driven my husband to drink with my nagging, how I'd let myself go, gotten fat and lazy, cared more about books and machines than being a proper wife, how no decent man would ever want me now. Her voice didn't shake, but Wade could see the cost of staying composed. And people believed him, because it's easier to believe a wealthy man than a widow who doesn't fit into the box society wants her in. Wade's hands curled into fists at his sides. That's when you ran, he said. That's when I survived. There's a difference. She turned back to the irrigation system, her movements sharp with barely controlled anger. I'm not running anymore, Wade. I'm here. I'm working. And I'm not going to apologize for taking up space in a world that wishes I didn't. The words hung in the cold barn air. Wade looked at this woman, covered in grease, fixing a system 3 men had abandoned, refusing to be small or quiet or sorry for existing, and something shifted in him. Something that had been frozen solid for 6 years started to crack. Good, he said. Mabel blinked, surprised. Good? I don't want people who apologize for existing. I want people who get things done. He gestured at the pipes. You need help with that? You know anything about water systems? No, but I can follow instructions. For the first time since she'd started talking about her past, Mabel smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. All right then, hold this valve while I tighten the seal. They worked together in silence for the next hour, and Wade found himself noticing things he'd been trying not to see. The way Mabel's mind worked through problems with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The way she didn't make him talk when he didn't want to. The way her presence felt comfortable instead of intrusive. By the time they finished, the irrigation system hummed to life perfectly. Mabel stood back, hands on her hips, looking satisfied. There. That should hold through spring. You just saved me about $300, Wade said. Then I've earned my keep this week. You earned your keep the first day you cooked breakfast. She looked at him then, something shifting in her expression. Wade. Boss! Garrett's voice cut across the barn, urgent and sharp. Wade turned to see the old cowboy jogging toward them, his face tight with concern. What is it? Riders coming in, 3 of them. They're asking for Miss Cross. Every muscle in Wade's body went tight. They say who they were? No, sir, but they're not friendly. I can tell that much. Mabel had gone very still beside him. Describe them. Garrett looked at her. 2 big men, hired gun types, and 1 older fellow, well-dressed, riding a horse that cost more than most men make in a year. Silas, Mabel whispered. Wade's jaw clenched hard enough to hurt. How far out? Maybe 10 minutes. Get the men. Tell them to be ready, but stay out of sight unless I signal. Wade's voice was cold, controlled. The voice he used when violence was about to happen and he needed everyone to know he was in charge. And get the rifles. Yes, sir. Garrett took off running. Wade turned to Mabel. She'd lost all color in her face, but she stood straight, her chin up, refusing to show fear even though he could see it in her eyes. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. I can leave, right now. He doesn't need to know I was ever here. Like hell. Wade, you don't understand what Silas is. I understand he's a man who thinks he can show up on my land and make demands. Wade's voice was low, dangerous. I understand he spent months making your life hell because he thinks you're too weak to fight back. And I understand... He stopped, something fierce and protective rising in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. I understand that you're under my protection now, which means if he wants to get to you, he goes through me first. Mabel stared at him. Why? Because you work for me. Because you're on my land. Because... He couldn't finish. Couldn't say the real reason out loud, not even to himself. Just stay in the house. Let me handle this. No. Mabel. If Silas is here, he already knows I'm here. Hiding won't change that. She straightened her shoulders, wiping the last of the grease from her hands. I've been running for months. I'm done. If he's got something to say to me, he can say it to my face. Wade wanted to argue. Wanted to lock her in the house and handle this the way he handled everything. Alone, with violence if necessary, and without anyone else getting hurt. But the look in Mabel's eyes stopped him. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling him how this was going to go. And despite everything, despite the danger, despite his instinct to protect her, Wade found himself respecting the hell out of that. Fine, he said, but you stay behind me. And if things go bad, you run. Understood? Understood. They walked out of the barn together, and Wade felt the weight of what was coming settle over him like a familiar coat. He'd been in situations like this before, confrontations with men who thought money and threats could get them whatever they wanted. It never ended well for them. This wouldn't be any different. The riders appeared at the edge of the property right on schedule. 3 men, just like Garrett had said. The 2 in front were exactly what Wade expected, hired muscle with dead eyes and hands that rested a little too casually near their holstered guns. The kind of men who got paid to hurt people and didn't ask questions. But it was the man in the middle who drew Wade's attention. Silas Vane was in his late 40s, well-groomed, wearing clothes that cost more than some of Wade's ranch hands made in 6 months. He sat his horse like a man who'd never done real work a day in his life, and his eyes, pale blue, calculating, swept across Black Hollow Ranch with the look of someone appraising property he intended to own. When his gaze landed on Mabel, his mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth at all. There you are, Silas said, his voice smooth and cultured. I've been looking everywhere for you, dear sister. Mabel didn't flinch. I'm not your sister, and I'm not your anything. Now, no need to be hostile. I've come all this way just to make sure you're safe. His eyes flicked to Wade, dismissive. And who might you be? Wade stepped forward, putting himself between Silas and Mabel. Wade Holloway. This is my land, and the woman you're looking for works for me now. Silas's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Wade Holloway. Yes, I've heard of you. The hermit rancher who scared off half of Montana's eligible daughters. He chuckled. Though I have to say I'm surprised you'd take in my brother's widow. She can be, difficult. Difficult, Wade repeated flatly. Yes. Stubborn, argumentative, entirely too independent for her own good. My brother tried to correct those tendencies, but he shrugged. Some women simply can't be taught. Wade's hands curled into fists, but he kept his voice level. You're on my property uninvited, Vane. State your business or leave. My business is simple. Mabel has something that belongs to me, documents related to my late brother's estate. I've come to retrieve them and escort her back to civilization where she belongs. I don't have any documents, Mabel said sharply. You stole everything, remember? The land, the house, even my mother's jewelry. There's nothing left. Now you're lying. Silas's voice hardened, the polite veneer cracking. I know you took papers from the house before you ran, papers that could cause me considerable trouble if they ended up in the wrong hands. Maybe that's because those papers prove you're a fraud and a thief. Silas's face flushed red. Careful, Mabel. You're already in enough trouble. Don't make this worse for yourself. She's not in any trouble, Wade said, and she's not going anywhere with you. I'm sorry. Silas turned his full attention to Wade for the first time, and his eyes were hard as stones. But this is a family matter. It doesn't concern you. It concerns me when you show up on my land making threats. I haven't made any threats, Silas gestured to his hired men. I simply brought protection for the journey. Montana can be dangerous this time of year. Not as dangerous as it's about to get if you don't turn around and leave. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Wade could feel his ranch hands watching from the barn, from the bunkhouse, from every shadow where Garrett had positioned them. Could feel the tension coiling tighter, ready to snap. Silas broke first. His smile returned, but it was thinner now, edged with something ugly. I see. He looked past Wade to Mabel. So that's how it is. You've already latched onto another man with money. How predictable. Watch your mouth, Wade said quietly. Or what? You'll shoot me in front of witnesses? Silas laughed. I don't think so. You see, Mr. Holloway, unlike you, I have friends in high places. Senators, judges, men who can make your life very difficult if you interfere with my family business. Then they can get in line with everyone else who wants to make my life difficult. Won't make a damn bit of difference. Silas's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Won't be my first. Won't be my last. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Wade didn't move, didn't even blink. He'd stared down better men than these, and they all knew it. Silas, Mabel's voice cut through the tension. She stepped around Wade despite his warning look, standing in full view of her brother-in-law. You want to know where your precious documents are? She asked. Fine, I'll tell you. I sent them to a lawyer in Helena 2 weeks before I left, along with a detailed account of every forged signature, every bribed official, every lie you told to steal my husband's estate, and I gave him very clear instructions. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I die, if I'm forced to marry you, those documents go straight to the territorial governor. Silas had gone very still. You're bluffing. Am I? You want to test that theory? Because I promise you, Silas, the moment you lay a hand on me, your entire empire collapses. Every dirty secret, every crooked deal, everything you've built on lies and fraud. It all comes crashing down. Wade glanced at Mabel, surprised. She hadn't mentioned any of this. He'd assumed she was just running, trying to survive. She'd been planning. Silas's composure finally cracked completely. You stupid, ungrateful. Do you have any idea what you've done? The people I'm connected to don't forgive threats. Then they have something in common with me. You think you're safe here? You think this cowboy can protect you forever? Silas gestured wildly at Wade. He's one man on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. I have resources, connections, power you can't even imagine. All you have to do, Wade interrupted, his voice like ice, is leave. Now. Before I decide that 3 bodies in the snow is worth the paperwork. One of the hired guns actually reached for his gun. He didn't clear leather before Wade's rifle, which had appeared in his hands so fast Mabel hadn't even seen him move, pointed straight at the man's chest. I wouldn't, Wade said calmly. The hired gun froze. All around them, ranch hands emerged from cover, every single one armed, every single one aimed at Silas and his men. Garrett stood on the barn roof, rifle steady. Cooper flanked them from the left. 2 more men Mabel recognized from the bunkhouse covered the right side. They'd moved like ghosts, and now Silas and his hired guns were surrounded. You were saying? Wade asked. Something about resources? Silas looked around at the rifles pointed at him, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered across his face. He was used to intimidating people with money and status. He wasn't used to men who didn't care about either. This isn't over, he said, trying to salvage some dignity. Yeah, it is, Wade said. You're going to ride off my property. You're going to go back to wherever you came from, and you're going to pray that Mabel decides you're not worth sending those documents to the governor. Because if she changes her mind, if I even hear a rumor that you're causing her trouble, I'm going to come find you. And I won't bring lawyers. Silas's hands shook with rage. You'll regret this, Holloway. Both of you. Get out! For a moment, Wade thought Silas might actually be stupid enough to push it. But then one of the hired guns, the smarter of the two, tugged at his employer's reins. "Boss, we should go." Silas jerked the reins, turning his horse with enough force to make it dance sideways. "This isn't finished, Mabel, not by a long shot." "Yes," Mabel said quietly. "It is." They rode off at a gallop, snow kicking up behind them, disappearing into the late afternoon light. Wade didn't lower his rifle until they were completely out of sight. Neither did any of his men. They waited in silence, watching, making sure Silas didn't double back or try something stupid. Finally, Garrett climbed down from the barn roof. "Think he'll be back, boss?" "Probably." Wade's jaw was still tight, his eyes still scanning the horizon. "Men like that don't give up easy." "Then we'll be ready." Wade nodded once, then turned to his ranch hands. "Good work. Everyone back to your posts, and keep watch tonight. Double shifts. I don't trust that bastard not to try something after dark." The men dispersed, and suddenly it was just Wade and Mabel standing in the snow. She was shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline, fear, relief, all of it hitting at once now that the danger had passed. Wade watched her struggle to control it, watched her force her breathing steady, watched her refuse to fall apart, even though she had every right to. "You lied," he said finally. Mabel looked up at him. "What?" "About the documents, about sending them to Helena." It wasn't a question. She smiled weakly. "How'd you know?" "Because if you'd really done that, you would have told me the first day you got here. Used it as leverage to make sure I'd help you." Wade studied her face. "You were bluffing, the whole thing." "The documents are real. I did take them from the house, but I couldn't afford a lawyer in Helena." Mabel's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're hidden in my coat lining, have been this whole time." "And if Silas had called your bluff? Then at least I would have gone down fighting instead of begging." Wade stared at her. This woman who'd just faced down the man who'd destroyed her life with nothing but words and sheer nerve, and felt something in his chest break completely. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met," he said, "or the most reckless. Can it be both?" Despite everything, despite the danger, despite the certainty that this was far from over, Wade almost smiled. "Come on," he said. "Let's get inside. We need to figure out what to do with those documents before Silas comes back with reinforcements." They walked back to the house together, and Wade felt the weight of what he'd just done settling over him. He'd made an enemy today. A powerful one with connections and resources, and no shortage of ways to make life difficult. But as he glanced at Mabel walking beside him, her chin still up, her spine still straight despite everything she'd just been through, Wade realized he didn't regret it. Not even a little bit. That night, after the ranch had settled into an uneasy quiet, Wade found himself unable to sleep. He sat in his office, the documents Mabel had given him spread across his desk, reading through page after page of forged signatures, falsified property transfers, and bribed official reports. Silas Vane wasn't just a thief. He was part of something bigger, a network of corruption that stretched across Montana, involving territorial officials, land speculators, and at least 2 senators. And Mabel had evidence of all of it. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." Mabel entered, wrapped in one of the blankets from the guest room, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exhausted, but sleep clearly wasn't coming for her either. "Can't rest?" Wade asked. "Keep seeing his face, hearing his voice." She moved to the window, staring out at the dark expanse of the ranch. "I keep thinking he's out there somewhere, planning his next move." "He probably is." "That's not comforting." "Wasn't meant to be comforting. Was meant to be honest." Wade set down the papers he'd been reading. "These documents, they're dangerous, Mabel. Not just to Silas, to everyone he's connected with. If this got out, it would destroy him. I know." She turned to face Wade. "That's why I kept them. Why I didn't just throw them away and disappear somewhere he'd never find me. Because men like Silas don't stop unless you make them stop. And the only way to make them stop is to have something they're more afraid of than they are powerful." Wade studied her in the firelight. "You know what happens if we use these, right? Silas won't just come after you. He'll come after me, the ranch, everyone who works here. He'll use every connection he has to try and bury us both." "I know. That's why I never asked you to help me fight him. I was just going to work here until I'd saved enough money to disappear somewhere he'd never look." Mabel's voice was quiet but steady. But now he knows where I am, which means I can't run anymore. So I either fight or I surrender, and I'm done surrendering. Then we fight. Wade, you don't have to. Yeah, I do. He stood, crossing to where she stood by the window. I told Silas you were under my protection. I don't say things I don't mean. Even if it costs you everything? I've got 40,000 acres, more cattle than I can count, and enough money to outlast most of the vultures in this territory. What I don't have... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. What I haven't had in 6 years is a reason to use any of it, to fight for something that matters, instead of just existing. Mabel's eyes searched his face. I matter? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them were quite ready to face. Wade thought about lying, about deflecting, about maintaining the walls that had kept him safe for so long. Instead, he told the truth. Yeah, he said simply. You do. For a long moment, they just stood there, close enough that Wade could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could smell the faint scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her hair. Then Mabel did something that surprised him. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work, smaller than his, but just as strong. She squeezed once, quick, firm, full of everything she couldn't say out loud, then let go and stepped back. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, for standing up when you didn't have to, for... Her voice broke. For making me feel like I'm worth fighting for. Mabel, I should let you work. We can talk about strategy in the morning. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. Wade, when this is over, when Silas is dealt with and the dust settles, I'm leaving. Going somewhere far from here, starting fresh where no one knows my history. Wade's chest went cold. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want you to think I'm using you. That I'm staying because I expect something more than a job and a place to sleep. She looked at him one last time, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. I just wanted you to know that. Whatever happens next, whatever we have to do to survive this, it doesn't change the fact that I'm still the woman who showed up half dead in a blizzard. And when it's safe, I'll leave the same way I came. On my own terms, owing nothing to anyone. She left before he could respond. Wade stood alone in his office, staring at the closed door, feeling something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Loss. The anticipation of it anyway. The knowledge that he'd found something worth keeping and that it was already planning to leave. He looked down at his hand, the one Mabel had squeezed, and realized with absolute certainty that he was in serious trouble, because somewhere between the blizzard and tonight, between breakfast conversations and irrigation repairs and standing up to Silas Vane, Wade Holloway had started to care about Mabel Cross. And caring about someone meant being able to lose them, which was exactly what he'd sworn 6 years ago he'd never allow to happen again. Silas struck back faster than Wade expected. 3 days after the confrontation, a territorial marshal showed up at Black Hollow Ranch with a warrant for Mabel's arrest. Theft of property, the document claimed. Forgery. Fraud. A list of charges that would have been laughable if they weren't so clearly calculated to destroy her. Wade met the marshal at the gate, Garrett and 4 armed ranch hands flanking him. Marshal Perry, Wade said evenly. What brings you out here? The marshal, a thin man in his 50s with tired eyes and a badge that looked too heavy for his chest, held up the warrant without meeting Wade's gaze. Got orders to bring in Mabel Cross. She here? She is, and she's not going anywhere. Mr. Holloway, I don't want trouble. I'm just doing my job. Your job is serving warrants signed by judges Silas Vane bought and paid for? Wade's voice was quiet, dangerous. Because I've got those documents Mabel supposedly forged. Want to see them? Want to compare the signatures to the real ones? Or would that make your job too complicated? Marshal Perry shifted uncomfortably. Look, I know how this works. Rich men get what they want, and folks like us get stuck in the middle. But the warrant's legal, and if I don't bring her in, they'll send someone who will. Someone who won't care about asking questions first. Then tell them to send that someone, because the answer's still going to be no. Wade, the marshal rubbed his face, exhaustion bleeding through his professional mask. You're putting me in an impossible position. Good, because Mabel's been in an impossible position for months, and no one gave a damn about that. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Marshal Perry sighed, folded the warrant, and tucked it back into his coat. I'll tell them you refused to cooperate, that you threatened violence if I tried to take her. I didn't threaten violence. No, but your boys are holding rifles, and I'm not stupid enough to think they're just for show. Perry turned his horse. This won't end here, Wade. Vane's got friends all the way up to the territorial governor. They'll keep coming until they get what they want. Let them come. The marshal shook his head slowly. You're a good man, Wade, but good men lose fights like this more often than they win them. He rode off, and Wade watched him disappear into the distance with a growing certainty that this was just the beginning. Inside the house, Mabel stood at the window, her face pale but composed. She'd heard everything. He's going to escalate, she said quietly. Silas doesn't know how to lose. He'll use every connection he has to make this unbearable for you. Then we escalate too. Wade crossed to his desk, pulling out the documents they'd spent the last 3 nights cataloging and organizing. We've got proof of fraud, bribery, conspiracy. We take this to the newspapers, to honest lawyers, to anyone who will listen. Wade, the people Silas is connected to control most of the newspapers. They own the lawyers. That's how corruption works. It protects itself. Then we find the ones they don't own. He looked at her, his jaw set. I'm not letting him win this, Mabel. Not after everything you've survived to get here. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. It became my fight the second I let you through that door. Mabel's eyes filled with something Wade couldn't quite name. Gratitude? Maybe. Or disbelief that someone was finally standing with her instead of against her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Before she could try again, the sound of horses drew both their attention back to the window. But this time, it wasn't the marshal returning. It was a woman. She rode alone, confident and elegant even in traveling clothes, her auburn hair pinned back beneath a practical hat. She dismounted before anyone could help her, tied her horse with practiced ease, and walked toward the house like she owned the place. Wade frowned. Who the hell? The front door opened without a knock. Wade Holloway, the woman called out, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of people listening when she spoke. I heard you've gotten yourself into some interesting trouble. Wade stepped into the hallway, Mabel close behind him. The woman stood in his entryway, brushing snow from her coat, looking utterly unbothered by the fact that she'd just walked uninvited into a stranger's home. Who are you? Wade asked. Catherine Brennan. I own the Helena Independent. She pulled off her gloves, studying Wade with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. And before you ask, yes, I rode 2 days to get here because your little standoff with Silas Vane is the most interesting story I've heard in months. Mabel stepped forward. How did you know about that? Darling, everyone knows about it. Silas has been making noise all across the territory about the ungrateful widow who stole from him and the cowboy protecting her. He's trying to control the narrative, paint himself as the victim. Catherine's smile was sharp. Which means he's worried, and when men like Silas Vane get worried, that's when they make mistakes. Wade crossed his arms. And you think you can help us because I've been trying to nail Silas Vane for 3 years. That man has more dirty secrets than a politician's diary, but he's been careful. Every time I get close to something solid, he either buries it or buys off my sources. She looked at Mabel. But if you really have documents proving his fraud, that changes everything. What's in it for you? Wade asked bluntly. The truth, a good story, and the satisfaction of watching a corrupt bastard finally face consequences. Catherine moved further into the house, uninvited but clearly unconcerned about protocol. Plus, I don't like seeing women get crushed by men who think power makes them untouchable. Call it a character flaw. Mabel glanced at Wade, uncertain. He could see the question in her eyes. Could they trust this woman? Wade wasn't sure, but they were running out of options. What do you need? He asked. The documents. Time to verify them. And your permission to run the story? Consequences be damned. Catherine's expression turned serious. But I need you to understand what you're getting into. Once this goes public, Silas won't just come after Mabel. He'll come after both of you. He'll use every weapon he has, legal, financial, social. He'll destroy your reputations, your businesses, everything you've built. Are you prepared for that? Wade looked at Mabel. She stood very still, her dark eyes fixed on him, waiting for his answer. waiting to see if he'd back down now that the reality of what they faced was laid out so clearly. He thought about the 6 years he'd spent hiding from the world, thought about the walls he'd built, the isolation he'd chosen, the life he'd lived that wasn't really living at all. Then he thought about what the last few months had been like. The sound of laughter in his kitchen, the way the ranch felt alive again, the way Mabel had pulled him out of his self-imposed prison without even trying. "Yeah," he said. "I'm prepared." Catherine smiled. "Good. Then let's burn this bastard to the ground." The next 2 weeks were chaos. Catherine set up camp at Black Hollow Ranch, turning Wade's dining room into a makeshift newsroom. She brought in a photographer, a fact-checker, and 2 lawyers from Helena who weren't on Silas's payroll. Together, they went through every document, verified every signature, traced every bribe transaction. And what they found was worse than any of them expected. Silas wasn't just stealing from his sister-in-law. He was part of a massive land fraud scheme that had been running for years, orchestrated by Senator Calvin Whitaker. They'd been buying up property from vulnerable owners, widows, immigrants, anyone who couldn't fight back, using forged documents and corrupt officials to legitimize the theft. Then they'd flip the land to railroad companies and mining operations for massive profits. Mabel's case was just one of hundreds. "This is bigger than I thought," Catherine said one night, spreading photographs and documents across the table. "If we publish this, we're not just taking down Silas, we're exposing an entire network." "Will people care?" Mabel asked quietly. She sat at the far end of the table, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Most of the victims are people no one listens to. Women like me. Poor families. People society already ignores." "That's exactly why they'll care," Catherine said firmly. "Because once we show the scope of this, once people realize how many lives these men have destroyed, it stops being about one widow's land dispute. It becomes about whether we're going to let corruption rot this territory from the inside out." Wade leaned against the doorframe, watching them work. He'd stayed mostly out of the way during the investigation, letting Catherine and her people do what they did best. But he felt the weight of what was coming, felt it in the way the ranch hands looked at him with concern, in the way Garrett had started sleeping in the barn with a loaded rifle. They all knew Silas wouldn't go quietly. The attack came on a Tuesday, not with guns or violence, but with something worse, money. Wade's bank in town sent word that his accounts had been frozen pending an investigation into financial irregularities. His government contracts for supplying beef to the Army were suddenly under review, and the Territorial Land Office sent notice that Black Hollow Ranch's property boundaries were being disputed due to questionable documentation. All of it happening simultaneously. All of it coordinated. Garrett brought the news to Wade while he was checking the cattle in the south pasture. The old cowboy's face was grim. "They're coming at us from every direction, boss. Banking, contracts, even the land itself. Silas must have called in every favor he had." Wade stared out at his ranch, 40,000 acres that had been in his family for 30 years, that he'd fought to keep running even after losing everything that mattered. And now some corrupt politician and his lapdog thought they could just take it. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "Banks will stay frozen until the investigation's complete. Could be weeks, could be months. Contracts are suspended immediately. And the land dispute," Garrett shook his head, "that could drag on for years if they want it to. Which means no income, no way to pay the hands, and legal fees we can't afford." "Yes, sir." Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Call the men together. Tonight. Everyone needs to hear this from me." That evening, Wade stood in the bunkhouse facing 23 ranch hands who'd worked for him through good times and bad. Men who depended on him for their livelihoods, who had families to feed and bills to pay. "You've all heard what's happening," he said without preamble. "Silas Vane and his people are trying to destroy this ranch because I'm protecting Mabel Cross. They've frozen my accounts, canceled my contracts, and tied up my land in legal disputes that could take years to resolve." The men shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances. Wade continued, "Which means I can't pay you. Not this month, maybe not for several months. And I won't lie to you, there's a chance we lose this fight. A chance the ranch goes under and all of this is for nothing." Cooper, the young hand who'd carved Mabel that flower, spoke up. "What are you saying, boss? That we should leave?" "I'm saying you should do what's best for your families. If you need to find work elsewhere, I'll understand. I'll write letters of recommendation, help however I can. No hard feelings. Silence fell over the bunkhouse. Then Garrett stood. Boss, I've worked for you for 12 years. Watched you build this place up after your father died. Watched you keep it running even when you had every reason to give up. He looked around at the other men. And I've watched what's happened these last few months since Miss Mabel arrived. This ranch finally feels like it's got a heartbeat again. You think I'm walking away from that because some corrupt son of a bitch wants to play games? I can't pay you, Garrett. Don't care. I've got savings. And I've got principles. He crossed his arms. I'm staying. One by one, the other men stood. I'm staying, Cooper said. Me too, another voice called out. Count me in, said another. Down the line they went, every single man choosing to stay despite having no guarantee they'd ever see another paycheck. Wade felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it could feel anything at all. You're all fools, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Garrett grinned. Yeah, well, we learn from the best. The men laughed, and the tension broke. They spent the next hour planning how to keep the ranch running with no money, rationing supplies, pooling resources, figuring out which cattle they could sell quickly for cash if needed. When Wade finally made it back to the house, he found Mabel waiting in the great room. She'd been crying. He could see it in her red-rimmed eyes, but she'd stopped by the time he walked in. Your men are staying, she said. Yeah. Because of me. Because you decided I was worth protecting. Her voice broke. Wade, I never wanted this. Never wanted you to lose everything because I'm not losing everything. He crossed to where she stood, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he let himself get close. Really close. Close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. Close enough to smell the soap she used. Close enough that if he wanted to, he could reach out and... He didn't. Instead, he said what he'd been trying not to say for weeks. Before you came here, I had money and land and cattle and absolutely nothing worth fighting for. Now I've got men who'd work without pay because they believe in something bigger than themselves. I've got purpose. I've got... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. I've got you. Mabel's breath hitched. Wade, I know what you said, that you're leaving when this is over. And maybe you will. But right now, in this moment, I need you to understand something. He finally let himself touch her, just his fingers against her cheek, gentle and careful like she might break. I would lose everything I own 100 times over if it meant you were safe. If it meant men like Silas Vane couldn't hurt you anymore. That's not a sacrifice. That's just the truth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't deserve... Don't. His thumb brushed away the tears. Don't you dare say you don't deserve this. You deserve someone who sees you, who fights for you, who doesn't make you feel like you need to be smaller or quieter or less than you are just to exist in the world. Is that what you see when you look at me? Wade smiled. A real smile. Probably the first genuine one he'd given in 6 years. I see the woman who walked through a blizzard and refused to beg. I see someone who's stronger than half my ranch hands and smarter than most men I've met. I see... His voice dropped to almost a whisper. I see the person who made me remember what it feels like to be alive. Mabel reached up, covering his hand with hers where it still rested against her cheek. I'm scared. Of Silas? Of this. Of caring about someone when I know how badly it can end. Yeah, Wade said quietly. Me too. They stood like that for a long moment, neither willing to close the final distance between them, both terrified of what it would mean if they did. Then Mabel made the choice. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't dramatic or swept away by passion or any of the things stories made kissing out to be. It was careful and tentative and full of all the fear and hope and desperate wanting that had been building between them for months. Wade's arms came around her, pulling her close, and for the first time since losing the woman he'd loved 6 years ago, he let himself feel something other than ice. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mabel rested her forehead against his chest. I'm still leaving when this is over, she whispered. Wade's arms tightened around her. I know. I just needed you to know that this, whatever this is, it's real, even if it can't last. I know that too. They held each other in the firelight, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something worth fighting for that went beyond land disputes and corruption scandals. Maybe they'd found each other. The next morning, Catherine Brennan's story hit every newspaper in Montana Territory. The headline screamed across the front page: Senator's land fraud scheme exposed. Hundreds of families defrauded. Below it, photographs of forged documents, testimonies from victims, evidence that even the most corrupt official couldn't ignore. Catherine had laid it all out in precise, devastating detail: names, dates, amounts, everything. And right in the center of the story, illustrated with a photograph Catherine had taken without permission, were Wade and Mabel standing together on the porch of Black Hollow Ranch. The caption read, "Ranch owner Wade Holloway and widow Mabel Cross, whose evidence broke the case wide open." Wade stared at the newspaper, something cold settling in his gut. "She made us the face of this." "She made us targets," Mabel said quietly. She was right. By noon, 3 more newspapers had picked up the story. By evening, it had spread across the entire territory. And by the next morning, the territorial governor had announced a formal investigation into Senator Whitaker's land deals. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Families who'd lost their land came forward. Newspapers that had previously been silent suddenly found their courage. Even some of Silas's bought and paid for officials started quietly distancing themselves, sensing which way the wind was blowing. But Silas and Whitaker weren't finished. The counterattack came through the one weapon Wade hadn't anticipated: Mabel herself. New stories started appearing in competing newspapers, vicious, personal attacks that had nothing to do with land fraud, and everything to do with destroying Mabel's character. They called her a seductress who'd manipulated Wade Holloway, a gold digger who'd driven her first husband to drink, a woman of questionable morals who'd been seen living alone with a man she wasn't married to, and worst of all, they mocked her appearance. Political cartoons showed her as grotesquely overweight, sitting on top of a pile of money while Wade, drawn as a fool, offered her more. Editorial columns questioned what kind of man would choose a woman like her unless she had some hold over him. The cruelty was calculated and relentless. Wade watched Mabel read the newspapers with a blank expression, watched her fold them carefully and set them aside without comment. But he saw the way her hands shook, saw the way she stopped eating, saw the way she started making herself smaller again, like she had when she first arrived. "Don't listen to them," he said one morning after finding her staring at another vicious cartoon. "It's hard not to when everyone's saying the same thing. They're saying it because they have nothing else, because the actual evidence is on our side, so they're trying to make this about you instead." "It's working." Mabel's voice was hollow. "People are talking. I heard it when I went into town yesterday. The whispers, the looks. They think I'm using you." "I don't care what they think." "But I do." She finally looked at him, and the pain in her eyes made Wade's chest ache. "Because they're not wrong, are they? You have lost everything because of me. Your money, your contracts, your reputation, and for what? So I don't have to marry a man I hate? For justice, for doing what's right. Pretty words. But they don't pay your ranch hands or fix your reputation or make people stop looking at us like we're some kind of scandalous joke." Wade moved closer, but she stepped back, the first time she'd pulled away from him since they'd kissed. "Mabel, maybe I should just leave. Go somewhere far away where Silas can't find me, where you can tell everyone I tricked you and get your life back to normal. Is that what you want?" "It's what makes sense." "That's not what I asked." Mabel's composure finally cracked. "What I want doesn't matter. Don't you see that? I wanted my husband to love me. He married me for money. I wanted to keep my home. Silas stole it. I wanted to feel safe. I spent 6 months running for my life, and now I want—" She stopped, tears streaming down her face. "I want to stay here with you and not feel like I'm destroying everything you've built. But I can't have that either because the world doesn't let women like me have what we want." "Women like you?" "Fat, unwanted, wrong." The words came out bitter, broken. "Don't pretend you don't see it, Wade. Don't pretend the whole territory isn't laughing at the idea that someone like you would choose someone like me." Wade closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with enough force to make her look at him. "You want to know what I see?" His voice was low, intense. "I see the strongest person I've ever met. I see someone who's survived things that would have broken most people. I see a woman who's brilliant and brave and so damn stubborn she walked through a blizzard rather than give up." His grip softened, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "And yeah, I see someone who doesn't fit into the narrow little box society wants to put women in. Thank God for that. Wade, I'm not finished. Every single person mocking you right now, they're doing it because they're scared, because you're proof that their whole system is broken, that their ideas about who deserves respect and who doesn't are garbage. And they can't handle that, so they try to tear you down. He pulled her closer. But I won't let them. And more importantly, you won't let them. Because you didn't survive everything you've survived just to let some newspaper cartoonist decide your worth. Mabel was crying openly now, her whole body shaking. I'm so tired of fighting. I know, but you don't have to fight alone anymore. Wade pulled her into his arms, holding her while she fell apart. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. They stood like that for a long time, long enough for the tears to stop, long enough for Mabel's breathing to steady, long enough for the fear to recede a little. Finally, she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. This is such a mess. Yeah, Wade agreed. It really is. What are we going to do? Wade thought about it for a moment. Then he smiled. That same fierce smile that made him look dangerous and protective all at once. We're going to win, he said simply. We're going to fight Silas and Whitaker and every corrupt bastard who thinks they can crush people and get away with it. We're going to show the whole territory that you don't mess with Black Hollow Ranch. And then, he cupped her face in his hands. Then you're going to decide what you want. Stay or go. I won't stop you either way, but you're going to make that choice free and clear without Silas hanging over your head. Deal? Mabel searched his face, and slowly, finally, she nodded. Deal. Good. Wade pressed a kiss to her forehead. Now come on. Catherine just sent word that the governor wants to meet with us. Time to take this fight public. They walked out of the house together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. And watching from the shadows of the tree line, a man with pale blue eyes and expensive clothes rode away with murder in his heart. Silas Vane had finally realized he couldn't win this fight the legal way, which meant he was about to make things much, much worse. The fire started just after midnight. Wade woke to the sound of shouting and the acrid smell of smoke curling through his bedroom window. He was on his feet and halfway down the stairs before his brain fully caught up, instinct and 6 years of ranch management taking over. Garrett met him at the bottom, his face streaked with soot. The South Barn, boss. It's bad. Wade didn't waste time asking questions. He grabbed his coat and ran. The scene outside was chaos, painted in orange and red. Flames consumed the South Barn, the oldest structure on the property, the one that held most of their winter feed and equipment. Men ran in organized panic, forming bucket lines from the well, throwing water that seemed to evaporate before it even touched the fire. Get the horses out, Wade shouted, already moving toward the barn. The heat hit him like a physical wall, scorching his lungs with each breath. Cooper emerged from the smoke, leading 2 panicked horses, their eyes rolling white with terror. That's the last of them, boss. Building's too far gone. Wade knew he was right. The fire had already eaten through half the roof, and the supporting beams were groaning like dying things. Going in now would be suicide. But then he saw Mabel. She stood near the tree line, her nightdress covered by a hastily thrown-on coat, her face illuminated by the flames. She wasn't watching the barn. She was watching the woods. Wade followed her gaze and saw it, a figure on horseback, barely visible in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, watching, waiting. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. Garrett! Wade grabbed the old cowboy's arm. Take 5 men and circle around through the north pasture. Someone's out there. On it. Garrett took off at a run, whistling for the others. Wade moved to Mabel's side. She didn't look at him, her eyes still fixed on where the rider had vanished. It was him, she said quietly. Silas. I saw his face in the firelight. You sure? I'm sure. Her voice was hollow. He wanted me to see him. Wanted me to know he did this. Wade's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The barn was collapsing now, sending up showers of sparks that danced against the night sky like dying stars. Hours of work and thousands of dollars worth of feed and equipment gone. And for what? To send a message? He's escalating, Mabel continued, still staring at the woods. The legal attacks aren't working fast enough, so now he's trying to bleed you dry. Destroy your property piece by piece until you have nothing left to fight with. Then he doesn't know me very well. Wade. She finally looked at him, and the guilt in her eyes was worse than the fire. "This has to stop. I can't watch him destroy you because I was too stubborn to just disappear. We've had this conversation. That was before he started burning down your ranch." Her voice cracked. "What's next? The house? The cattle? How many more attacks before you admit that protecting me isn't worth losing everything you've built?" Wade grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me. Silas Vane could burn every building on this property to ash. He could take every dollar I have. He could turn the entire territory against me. And you know what I'd still have?" "What?" "A reason to get up in the morning. Something worth fighting for instead of just existing." His grip softened. "You gave me that back. So don't you dare try to take it away by leaving." Mabel's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, Garrett returned with his men. Their expressions told Wade everything he needed to know. "Lost him in the woods," Garrett said, breathing hard. "But we found where he'd been waiting. Tracks show at least 2 horses, maybe 3. And this." He held up a nearly empty bottle of kerosene. Wade took it, the glass still warm. "Proof. Not that it would matter in court, not with the judges Silas had bought, but proof nonetheless. Postguards on every building," Wade ordered. "Rotating shifts, no one sleeps alone. If anyone sees anything, and I mean anything, they sound the alarm immediately." The men nodded and dispersed. Wade turned back to the burning barn, watching his past go up in flames, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Silas had just made this personal in a way that crossed a line even corrupt politicians usually knew better than to cross. You didn't burn a man's property in Montana and expect to walk away clean. The next morning brought news that made the barn fire seem almost insignificant by comparison. Catherine Brennan arrived at dawn, her horse lathered from hard riding, her face grim. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Senator Whitaker is holding a press conference in Helena this afternoon. He's claiming the entire fraud story is fabricated. That you and Mabel manufactured evidence to extort money from legitimate businessmen." Wade set down his coffee with deliberate calm. "And people believe that?" "Some do. Whitaker's got decades of political credibility, and he's using all of it. He's painting himself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by, and I'm quoting here, a disturbed widow and her delusional protector." Catherine pulled out a newspaper, slapping it on the table. "It gets worse." The headline read, "Holloway Ranch Fire. Arson or insurance fraud?" Wade's vision went red around the edges. "They're saying I burned my own barn. They're implying it, suggesting you're so desperate for money after your accounts were frozen that you staged the fire to collect insurance. And with Silas's lawyers swearing he was nowhere near your property last night, you can't prove otherwise. We have tracks, kerosene bottles, which any decent lawyer will say you could have planted yourself." Catherine's expression was sympathetic but honest. "Wade, they're better at this game than we are. They've been playing it longer, with more resources and fewer scruples. And right now, they're winning the narrative war." Mabel, who'd been sitting silently at the far end of the table, finally spoke. "What about the families? The other victims of the fraud? Can't they testify?" "Most of them are too scared. Silas and Whitaker have made it very clear what happens to people who speak against them." Catherine rubbed her face, exhaustion bleeding through. "I've got 3 families who've agreed to go on record, but it's not enough. Not against a sitting senator with half the territorial government in his pocket." "Then what do we do?" Wade asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We fight dirty." She pulled out a folder Wade hadn't noticed before, spreading its contents across the table. Photographs, documents, letters, all of it clearly obtained through methods that weren't exactly legal. "I've been investigating Whitaker for 3 years, Catherine said, "and I've found things. Private correspondence showing he knew about the fraud from the beginning, financial records proving he personally profited from stolen land sales, even," she tapped one particular photograph, "evidence that he had a territorial judge removed when the man started asking too many questions about land titles." Wade studied the documents. "Where did you get these? Do you really want to know?" "No, but I need to know if they're real." "They're real. I verified every piece, but here's the problem. I obtained most of it through sources I can't reveal without destroying them. If I publish this, Whitaker will sue me into oblivion. He'll shut down the Independent, ruin my credibility, maybe even have me arrested for theft of private documents." Then why are you showing us? Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen too much corruption to have many illusions left. Because sometimes you have to decide what matters more, protecting yourself or doing what's right. And I'm tired of watching powerful men destroy lives while I play by rules they ignore. Mabel leaned forward, studying the documents with the same analytical precision she brought to everything. If you publish this, it's over for you professionally, maybe personally too. I know. So why risk it? Because I'm not married, don't have kids, don't have anyone depending on me except myself. And if I can't use that freedom to fight the battles that need fighting, what's the point of having it? Catherine's smile was thin but genuine. Besides, I've always wanted to go out with a bang instead of a whimper. Wade understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. When's Whitaker's press conference? He asked. 3:00. Then we've got 6 hours to get this to every newspaper in the territory that isn't on his payroll. And after that? After that, we see which side people choose when they finally know the whole truth. They worked through the morning in focused silence, making copies of everything, writing up Catherine's findings in language even the most skeptical reader couldn't ignore. By noon, messengers were riding out to newspapers in every major town, carrying documents that would either end Whitaker's career or destroy what was left of Wade's reputation. There was no middle ground anymore. At 2:00, Wade found Mabel in the library, staring out the window at the charred remains of the south barn. "You should eat something," he said. "Not hungry." "Mabel, do you ever regret it?" She didn't turn around. "Letting me stay that first night, starting all of this." Wade crossed to where she stood, close enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion in the way she held herself. "No, not even now? With your barn burned and your reputation destroyed and a senator trying to ruin you? Not even now." She finally looked at him. "Why not?" "Because for 6 years I was already ruined. I just didn't know it yet." He touched her face, gentle and careful. "You didn't ruin me, Mabel. You saved me. By bringing all of this chaos into your life? By reminding me what it felt like to care about something again. To fight for something that mattered instead of just existing." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "I'd burn 100 barns if it meant you were safe, if it meant Silas and men like him couldn't hurt people anymore." Mabel's eyes searched his face. "What if we lose? What if Whitaker's press conference works and everyone believes we're frauds? Then we lose. But at least we'll lose knowing we fought back instead of rolling over." Wade pulled her closer. "I'm not afraid of losing money or property or reputation. I'm afraid of becoming that man I was 6 years ago, alive but not living. And as long as you're here, that won't happen." She kissed him then, hard and desperate, like she was trying to memorize the feeling before it disappeared. Wade kissed her back with 6 years of frozen emotion finally breaking free, his arms around her like he could protect her from everything coming if he just held on tight enough. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mabel pressed her forehead to his chest. "I'm staying," she whispered. "After this is over, whatever happens, I'm not leaving." Wade's arms tightened around her. "You sure? I've been running my whole life, from my husband's family, from Silas, from the idea that someone might actually want me to stay." She looked up at him. "But I'm done running. This is my home now. You're my home. And I'm not giving that up without a fight." Wade smiled, a real smile that felt foreign, but right. "Good. Because I wasn't going to let you go anyway." "That's so. That's so." They held each other in the afternoon light, drawing strength from the contact, neither willing to acknowledge that in less than an hour, everything might fall apart. Then Garrett knocked on the door. "Boss, it's time. Press conference is starting." Wade and Mabel joined Catherine and most of the ranch hands in the great room, where someone had set up the telegraph receiver to get live updates from Helena. The room was packed, everyone pressed together in tense silence. The first update came through at 3:15. Whitaker begins statement. Large crowd. Claims fraud allegations are political attack. Catherine paced near the fireplace, her jaw tight. "Come on, where are my people?" Another update. Whitaker presents character witnesses, judges and businessmen vouching for his integrity. Mabel's hand found Wade's, squeezing hard enough to hurt. He squeezed back. Then, at 3:30, the message they'd been waiting for. Independent courier arrives. Interruption at press conference. Distribution of documents begins. The room erupted in chaos, ranch hands cheering, Catherine laughing with something close to hysteria, everyone talking at once. But Wade stayed focused on the telegraph, waiting for the next update. It came 5 minutes later. Whitaker leaves stage, refuses questions, crowd in uproar. And then, the one that mattered. Territorial governor calls for immediate investigation. Whitaker's immunity suspended pending review. Catherine stopped pacing, her hand pressed to her mouth. We did it. We actually did it. But Wade knew better than to celebrate yet. Men like Whitaker didn't go down without taking others with them. The next update confirmed his instincts. Whitaker names accomplices. Silas Vane implicated directly. Warrants being issued. Mabel's grip on Wade's hand went slack. He's throwing Silas under the carriage. Politicians always do when they're cornered. Whitaker's trying to save himself by giving up everyone else. Which means Silas has nothing left to lose. Wade understood what she was saying. A desperate man with money and connections was dangerous. A desperate man with nothing left to lose was lethal. Garrett, Wade said quietly, double the guards, and get everyone armed. If Silas is going to make a move, it'll be tonight. The old cowboy nodded and started giving orders. The attack came at dusk, not with fire this time, but with something worse, violence. 6 hired guns rode onto the property, professional killers who didn't bother hiding what they were. They came in fast and hard, firing shots that sent the ranch hands scrambling for cover. Wade was ready. He'd positioned his men strategically, turning Black Hollow Ranch into a fortress. The gunfight that followed was short and brutal. 2 of the hired guns went down in the first volley, caught in crossfire from opposite directions. The others retreated toward the tree line, firing wildly. But Wade had learned long ago that the best defense was a vicious offense. He led a charge from the main house, Garrett and 5 men flanking him, driving the hired guns back into the woods. The fighting was close and dirty, the kind where you could see the fear in your enemy's eyes before you pulled the trigger. When it was over, 3 hired guns were dead, 2 wounded and captured, and 1 had escaped into the darkness. Wade's men had survived with only minor injuries. But as Wade stood in the aftermath, breathing hard and checking his men for wounds, a cold certainty settled over him. Silas wasn't with them. The hired guns were just a distraction. The house, Wade said suddenly. Get back to the... The scream cut through the night. Mabel. Wade ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, his heart hammering against his ribs, terror flooding his veins. He burst through the front door to find the great room destroyed, furniture overturned, a window shattered, and Mabel backed against the far wall with Silas Vane holding a pistol to her head. Finally, Silas said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. His expensive clothes were torn and dirty, his face scratched, his eyes wild with the look of a man who'd lost everything. The great Wade Holloway, here to save his whore. Wade forced himself to stay calm, every muscle coiled tight. Let her go, Silas. Let her go? Let her go? Silas laughed, high and unstable. She destroyed everything. My reputation, my business, my future, all because she couldn't just accept what she was. Nothing. A fat, worthless widow who should have been grateful I even looked at her twice. You're finished, Wade said quietly. Whitaker named you. There are warrants out for your arrest. Killing her won't change that. But it'll feel really good. Silas pressed the gun harder against Mabel's temple. She stood very still, her eyes on Wade, refusing to show fear even with death literally pressed against her skull. She took everything from me. So I'm taking everything from her, starting with her life, then yours. Then I'll burn this whole ranch to the ground before they catch me. Silas. Mabel's voice was steady, despite the terror Wade could see in her eyes. You've already lost. Killing us just makes it worse. I don't care. Silas's hand shook. I don't care about worse. I don't care about anything except making you pay for ruining me. Wade saw it then, the moment when Silas's fingers started to squeeze the trigger. Saw it happening in slow motion, knew he was too far away to stop it, knew he was about to watch the woman he loved die right in front of him. Then Mabel moved. She had been standing still, compliant, letting Silas think she was helpless. But Wade had seen her fix irrigation systems and survive blizzards and stare down corrupt politicians. Had seen her refuse to be small or quiet or sorry for existing. And apparently, she'd learned more than engineering from her father. Mabel's elbow drove back into Silas's ribs with enough force to crack bone. His shot went wild, the bullet slamming into the ceiling. Before he could recover, Mabel twisted, using her weight and momentum to throw him off balance. Wade was already moving. He crossed the room in 3 strides, slamming into Silas with enough force to drive them both to the ground. The pistol skittered across the floor. Silas tried to fight back, throwing wild punches. But Wade was bigger, stronger, and absolutely done with this man threatening people he cared about. The fight was over in seconds. Wade hauled Silas up by his collar, slamming him against the wall hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. "You're done. You're finished. And if you ever come near her again, they won't find enough of you to bury." Silas just laughed, blood running from his split lip. "You think you've won? You think this is over? They'll destroy you, both of you. The scandal, the gossip, the way everyone will look at you." "Let them look," Mabel said quietly. Both men turned to her. She stood in the middle of the destroyed room, her hair disheveled, a bruise already forming on her temple, but her spine straight and her eyes clear. "Let them gossip and stare and judge," she continued, "because I've spent my whole life being invisible to people who mattered and too visible to people who wanted to hurt me. And I'm done caring what anyone thinks except the people who actually see me for who I am." She looked at Wade, and something passed between them. Understanding, acceptance, love. "So let them talk," Mabel finished. "We'll be too busy living to listen." Garrett and the other ranch hands burst through the door, rifles ready. They stopped at the scene, Wade holding Silas against the wall, Mabel standing victorious in the rubble, the evidence of violence everywhere. "Boss?" Garrett asked. "Get Marshal Perry out here," Wade said, not taking his eyes off Silas. "Tell him we've got his prisoner." They dragged Silas away, still spitting threats and curses that grew fainter as they hauled him toward town. Finally, Wade and Mabel were alone in the wreckage of the great room. "You all right?" Wade asked. "I'm alive, that's something." Mabel touched the bruise on her temple, wincing. "Is it over?" "Yeah, I think it finally is." They stood in the middle of the destruction, overturned furniture, broken glass, bullet holes in the walls, and started laughing. It bubbled up from somewhere deep and exhausted, the kind of laughter that comes when you've survived something terrible and can't quite believe you're still breathing. Wade pulled Mabel into his arms, and they held each other in the ruins of his great room, both shaking with laughter and relief and the bone-deep exhaustion that comes after a fight that almost broke you. "Your house is destroyed," Mabel said eventually. "We'll fix it. Your barn is burned. We'll rebuild. Your reputation is in tatters. Never cared about it anyway." Wade pulled back enough to see her face. "As long as you're here, I don't care about any of it." Mabel smiled, tired and genuine and so beautiful it made Wade's chest ache. "Then I guess you're stuck with me." "Good," Wade said, and kissed her, surrounded by broken furniture and bullet holes and the evidence of everything they'd survived together. Outside, the ranch settled into watchful quiet. Guards patrolled, making sure no more threats emerged from the darkness. Horses stamped in their stalls. The wind carried the smell of ash from the burned barn. And in the great room of Black Hollow Ranch, 2 people who'd been broken by the world found something neither expected. Home. The weeks that followed Silas's arrest moved with the strange, disjointed quality of a life fundamentally altered. Wade woke each morning expecting to find it had all been a fever dream. The fire, the gunfight, Mabel standing in his ruined great room telling the world she didn't care what they thought. But every morning, she was there. Real. Solid. Usually already awake, making coffee in the kitchen or fixing something that had broken during the violence. The legal machinery ground forward with bureaucratic slowness. Silas sat in a Helena jail cell awaiting trial. Senator Whitaker had resigned in disgrace, his political allies abandoning him with the speed of rats fleeing a sinking ship. The territorial governor had launched a full investigation into the land fraud scheme, and newspapers across Montana were calling it the biggest corruption scandal in the territory's history. Catherine Brennan's Independent had tripled its readership. She'd become something of a folk hero, the journalist who'd taken down a senator. Though privately, when she visited the ranch, she admitted the cost had been higher than she'd let anyone see. 3 death threats last week, she said over coffee, her tone casual, but her eyes tired. And someone burned down my favorite restaurant because the owner gave me an interview. Apparently, taking down corrupt politicians makes you unpopular with their friends. Regret it? Wade asked. Catherine considered the question seriously. No, but I'm not naive enough to think winning feels the way I expected it to. She glanced at Mabel, who was organizing the library shelves. How about you two? How's victory treating you? Mabel laughed, but there was an edge to it. You mean besides the whispers every time we go into town? Or the women who cross the street to avoid me? Or the lovely editorial last week questioning Wade's sanity for shackling himself to damaged goods? People are idiots, Catherine said flatly. People are people, Mabel corrected. They like simple stories with clear villains and heroes. A plus-size widow and a reclusive rancher taking down a political empire doesn't fit neatly into anyone's narrative, so they're trying to rewrite it into something that makes sense to them. Wade watched her speak with the calm pragmatism that had drawn him to her in the first place. She wasn't pretending the gossip didn't hurt. She just refused to let it define her. They'll move on eventually, Catherine said. Find some new scandal to obsess over. Maybe. Mabel set down the book she'd been holding. Or maybe they won't. Maybe for the rest of my life I'll be the woman who caused all that trouble, the one who didn't know her place. And? Wade asked quietly. Mabel looked at him, and something fierce and determined flickered in her eyes. And I'm fine with that. Better to be remembered for causing trouble than forgotten for being convenient. Catherine raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. I'll drink to that. But the toll of everything they'd survived showed in ways that weren't as easy to dismiss with defiant words. Wade caught Mabel staring out windows at nothing, her expression distant. Saw her flinch at sudden noises. Watched her check and recheck the locks on doors even though Silas was locked away, and his hired guns were either dead or in custody. Trauma, Wade had learned 6 years ago, didn't just disappear because the danger had passed. One night, 3 weeks after Silas's arrest, Wade found Mabel in the rebuilt section of the south barn. She sat on a hay bale in the dim lantern light, her shoulders hunched, her face in her hands. He almost left her alone. Almost gave her the space she seemed to need. But he'd spent 6 years giving himself space, and all it had done was make him hollow. Can't sleep? He asked, settling onto the hay bale beside her. Mabel didn't look up. I keep seeing it. The moment he put that gun to my head, I keep thinking about how close... Her voice cracked. How close I came to losing everything. But you didn't. This time. What about next time? What happens when someone else decides I'm not worth the trouble I cause? When you wake up and realize your life was better before I stumbled into it? Wade turned her face toward him gently but firmly. Look at me. She did, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. There isn't going to be a next time, Wade said. Silas is finished. Whitaker's career is over. The people who wanted to hurt you are either in jail or too busy saving their own skins to care about you anymore. You don't know that. No, I don't. But I know this. I spent 6 years living like a ghost because I was too afraid of being hurt again. And all it got me was a cold house and a colder heart. His thumb brushed her cheek. Then you showed up and reminded me what it felt like to actually care about something, to fight for something that mattered. And yeah, it's been messy and violent and nothing like the safe, controlled life I'd built. But I'd take messy and violent with you over safe and dead inside without you. Every single time. Mabel's eyes searched his face. Even now? Even knowing what it cost? Especially now. Wade pulled her closer. The barn can be rebuilt. Money can be made back. Reputations were always overrated anyway. But finding someone who makes you want to be more than just surviving, that's worth protecting. That's worth fighting for. I'm scared, she whispered. Scared that I'm not enough. That eventually you'll see what everyone else sees, that I'm just some fat widow who caused more problems than she's worth. Wade's jaw tightened. You want to know what I see? What? I see the woman who walked through a blizzard rather than give up. I see someone who stared down her abuser with nothing but words and nerve. I see the person who turned a cold, empty house into a home just by being in it. He paused. And I see someone who's so busy thinking about what she lacks that she can't see what she's got. Strength, intelligence, courage that puts most men I know to shame, and a heart big enough to forgive a broken cowboy for being too scared to live for 6 years. Tears streamed down Mabel's face. That's a lot to live up to. Then it's a good thing you've got time, because I'm not letting you go anywhere. She kissed him then, soft and desperate, and full of all the fear and hope and tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could finally stop running. When they pulled apart, Mabel rested her head against Wade's shoulder. The gossip's not going to stop, you know. People love to talk. Let them talk. And the women in town who think I trapped you? They can think whatever they want, won't change the truth. Which is, Wade smiled into her hair, that you didn't trap me. I chose you. There's a difference. They sat like that in the rebuilt barn, surrounded by the smell of fresh hay and new wood, both broken in their own ways, but finding something whole in the spaces between their damage. The trial happened in early spring. Wade and Mabel traveled to Helena, accompanied by Garrett and a dozen ranch hands who refused to let them face it alone. The courthouse was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, families of victims who'd finally found the courage to come forward. Silas Vane sat at the defendant's table looking diminished. His expensive clothes couldn't hide the bruises from prison fights or the haunted look in his eyes. He'd aged years in a matter of weeks, reduced from a powerful manipulator to just another desperate criminal. The prosecution built their case methodically, document after document proving fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Witness after witness, including Mabel, testifying to Silas's crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, irrefutable. When Mabel took the stand, Wade watched her face down the man who'd destroyed her life with the same quiet strength she brought to everything else. She didn't cry or rage. She just told the truth, clearly and completely, leaving no room for doubt. Silas's lawyer tried to paint her as vengeful, manipulative, a woman scorned seeking revenge. Mabel looked the lawyer dead in the eye and said, "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice. There's a difference." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Silas's face went white as the verdict was read. He looked across the courtroom at Mabel, and Wade saw something flicker in his expression. Not remorse, but disbelief. Like he still couldn't quite comprehend that the woman he'd dismissed as worthless had been the one to bring him down. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in territorial prison, with additional charges pending for the attempted murder and arson at Black Hollow Ranch. It wasn't life, but it was enough. As they led Silas away in chains, he stopped beside Mabel's seat. The guards tensed, but he didn't try anything. He just looked at her with empty eyes. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. "Destroying everything for this?" Mabel stood, meeting him at eye level. "I didn't destroy everything, Silas. I rebuilt my life from the pieces you tried to break. And yeah, it was worth every single moment." They took him away. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some were supportive, victims of the fraud scheme, newspaper readers who'd followed the story, people who appreciated seeing corruption exposed. But others were hostile, shouting accusations and insults that cut deep despite Mabel's attempts to ignore them. "Whore! Gold digger! Troublemaker!" Wade's hands curled into fists, but Mabel put a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "They're not worth it. They're insulting you. They're scared, angry that the world isn't as simple as they want it to be. Doesn't mean I have to care what they think." She walked through the crowd with her head high, Wade beside her, and something shifted in the dynamic. The insults continued, but they sounded smaller somehow, weaker, like the people shouting them knew they were on the wrong side of history. That night, in the hotel room they'd rented for the trial, Mabel stood at the window looking out at Helena's gaslit streets. "It's really over," she said, wonder in her voice. "Yeah, it is. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to burst in and tell me it was all a mistake, that Silas is free and I need to run again." Wade crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You don't have to run anymore. You can just live. I'm not sure I remember how. Then we'll figure it out together." She turned in his arms, and Wade saw something in her expression he'd never seen before. Peace. Tentative and fragile, but real. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Whatever we want." "That's not very specific." Wade smiled. "No, it's not. But that's the point. For the first time in both our lives, we get to decide what comes next. No one chasing us, no one controlling us, no one telling us who we're supposed to be." Mabel considered that, I think I'd like to go home. To Black Hollow? Is there anywhere else? She smiled. That ranch is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged, like I could be exactly who I am without apology. Then that's where we'll go. They returned to Black Hollow Ranch 2 days later, welcomed by ranch hands who'd kept everything running in their absence. The south barn was finished, better than before. The great room had been repaired, the bullet holes patched, the broken furniture replaced. But it was the changes Mabel had started months ago that struck Wade the most. The library full of books she'd organized. The kitchen that smelled like home instead of just a place where food happened. The small touches throughout the house. Flowers in windows, mended curtains, signs that someone actually lived here instead of just existing. I was thinking, Mabel said that evening as they sat by the fire, about what to do with all that land Silas had to forfeit. The court said it would be redistributed to the original owners where possible. And where it's not possible, I thought maybe we could do something with it, something useful. She hesitated. I know you've got enough on your plate with this ranch, but I keep thinking about all the women like me, the ones who lose everything when their husbands die, who have nowhere to go and no way to support themselves. Wade studied her face. What are you thinking? A place for them. Not charity. A real working ranch where they can learn skills, earn wages, build new lives. We've got the land, the resources, the knowledge, and I've got the experience of being exactly where they are. Her eyes met his. I want to help them the way you helped me. Wade felt something warm spread through his chest. 6 years ago, he would have said no immediately, would have kept to himself, avoided complications, stayed safe in his isolation. But that man was gone. All right, he said, let's do it. Mabel's face lit up. Really? Really, on one condition. What? Wade pulled a small box from his pocket. He'd bought it in Helena, a simple gold band with a single stone, nothing flashy or expensive, just honest and real. Marry me first. Mabel stared at the ring, her mouth open. Wade, I know we've only known each other a few months. I know people will talk and say I'm crazy and you're using me. I know it's too fast and too complicated and probably a terrible idea by any reasonable standard. He opened the box. But I also know that you're the best thing that's happened to me in 6 years, and I'm done wasting time being careful when I could be living. So marry me, Mabel Cross. Not because you need protection or security or because society thinks it's proper. Marry me because you want to build something together, because you choose me the way I choose you. Tears streamed down Mabel's face. People are going to say you settled, that you could have had any beautiful woman in the territory. I don't want any beautiful woman in the territory. I want you, exactly as you are. I'm not easy to live with. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I take up too much space. Good. This house has too much space anyway. Might as well fill it with someone worth filling it with. She laughed through her tears. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. Is that a no? That's a yes, you idiot. She kissed him hard. Yes, I'll marry you, even though we're both broken and messy and have no idea what we're doing. Especially because of that. Wade slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which seemed impossible, but somehow right. They married 6 weeks later in the small frontier church in town, with ranch hands as witnesses and Catherine Brennan as maid of honor. The church was packed, some with genuine well-wishers, others with curious gossips who wanted to see the scandalous wedding for themselves. Wade didn't care who was there or why. He stood at the altar watching Mabel walk down the aisle in a simple dress that fit her curves perfectly, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes locked on his. She wasn't a perfect bride by society's standards. She was too heavy, too plain, too associated with scandal. But when Wade looked at her, he saw the woman who'd saved his life by giving him something to live for, saw strength and courage and stubborn determination wrapped in a package the world had tried to convince her wasn't worth looking at. The world was wrong. The ceremony was short, the vows traditional, but when the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Wade kissed Mabel like she was the most precious thing he'd ever held, because she was. The crowd erupted in applause mixed with scandalized whispers. Wade and Mabel ignored both. At the reception, held at Black Hollow Ranch because no other venue would host them, Cooper gave a rambling, heartfelt toast about how Mabel had taught him to read and made the ranch feel like family. Garrett told embarrassing stories about Wade's early days as a rancher. Catherine raised her glass and said, "To the couple who proved that love doesn't follow anyone's rules but its own." And Mabel, standing beside Wade with her hand in his, looked happier than he'd ever seen her. Late that night, after the guests had left and the ranch had settled into quiet, Wade and Mabel sat on the porch, watching the stars. "You know what the best part of today was?" Mabel asked. "What?" "When that woman, the one who's been spreading gossip about me for months, came up to congratulate us. And I realized I didn't care anymore. Not about her opinion or anyone else's. I just cared about this." She squeezed his hand. "About us." Wade understood that feeling. The freedom of finally not caring what the world thought because you'd found something more important than approval. "We're going to mess this up sometimes," he said. "Marriage, the ranch project, all of it. We're both too stubborn and damaged to do this perfectly." "Good. Perfect's overrated anyway." Mabel leaned against him. "I'd rather have messy and real with you than perfect and fake with anyone else. Even when I'm grumpy and withdrawn? Even then, as long as you promise to let me pull you out of it instead of shutting me out." "Deal. As long as you promise to tell me when the world gets too heavy instead of carrying it alone." "Deal." They sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, messy and uncertain and full of challenges they couldn't predict. But it was theirs. Over the next year, they built something remarkable. The women's ranch project started small, just 3 widows and their children living in the refurbished buildings on the redistributed land. Mabel taught them everything she knew about managing property, handling accounts, fixing machinery. Wade's ranch hands trained them in livestock management and sustainable farming. Word spread. More women came. Some fleeing bad situations, others just looking for a fresh start. The operation grew into something bigger than either Wade or Mabel had imagined. A community of people who'd been discarded by society, proving they were anything but disposable. The gossip about Wade and Mabel never fully stopped, but it shifted. It became background noise instead of the main story. People talked, but they also saw the results. The women who learned to support themselves, the children who got education, the land that flourished under careful management. Results were harder to argue with than scandal. 2 years after their wedding, on a spring morning that reminded Wade of the day Mabel had first stumbled onto his ranch, she found him in the rebuilt barn checking inventory. "I have news," she said, her expression nervous and excited. Wade set down his clipboard. "What kind of news?" "The kind that's going to change everything again." She took his hand, placing it on her stomach. "We're having a baby." Wade froze, his mind struggling to process the words. A baby. A child. Something he'd never let himself think about after losing everything 6 years ago. "Wade, say something." He looked at Mabel, his wife, his partner, the woman who'd pulled him back from the edge of emotional death, and felt tears burn his eyes for the first time since he was a boy. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Be a father. Build a family. I spent so long being alone that then we'll figure it out together, just like we figured out everything else." She smiled. "We're pretty good at that, remember?" Wade pulled her into his arms, holding her and the life growing inside her, and felt something settle in his chest. Something that had been restless and uncertain for years finally finding solid ground. "Yeah," he said, "we are." Their daughter was born in early winter, during a snowstorm that reminded everyone of the night Mabel had first arrived. She came into the world screaming, healthy and strong, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. They named her Catherine, after the journalist who'd helped them fight corruption. Catherine Brennan cried when they told her, which she later insisted was allergies. Wade held his daughter in the same great room where he'd first let Mabel through his door, where they'd planned their fight against Silas, where they'd built the foundation of the life they now shared. He looked at this tiny person, so vulnerable, so dependent on him, and made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing she was loved, knowing that her worth wasn't determined by how she looked or what society thought she should be, but by who she chose to become. The lessons he and Mabel had learned the hard way would be her birthright. 5 years later, Black Hollow Ranch had become something Wade never could have imagined. The women's program was thriving, now housing 20 families and operating as a fully self-sufficient operation. Cooper had married one of the program participants, a widow named Sarah with two young boys who called Wade Uncle and followed him around the ranch like puppies. Garrett had retired but refused to leave, spending his days teaching ranch skills to anyone who'd listen and spoiling Catherine with hand-carved toys. The ranch itself had expanded, not in ambition, but in purpose. It wasn't just about cattle and land anymore. It was about community, about proving that people written off by society could build something meaningful if someone gave them the chance. And Wade and Mabel stood at the center of it all, not as perfect leaders, but as two broken people who'd found healing in choosing each other every single day. One evening, Wade found Mabel on the porch where they'd sat the night of their wedding. Catherine played in the yard, chasing fireflies with the determined concentration of a 5-year-old on a mission. "Thinking about something?" Wade asked, settling beside his wife. Mabel leaned against him. "Thinking about how strange life is? How 6 years ago I was running for my life with nothing but the clothes on my back and a desperate hope that I'd survive another day. And now," she gestured at the ranch, at their daughter, at the life they'd built. "Now I have everything I never let myself believe I could have." "You earned it. We earned it. Together." She took his hand. "I keep trying to figure out what the lesson is. What I'm supposed to tell Catherine when she's old enough to ask how we got here." Wade thought about it, watching fireflies dance in the twilight while his daughter laughed with pure joy. "Tell her the truth," he said finally, "that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to fight through the mess with you. Someone who sees you completely, all the broken parts, all the pieces that don't fit society's mold, and chooses you anyway." "And choosing them back," Mabel added. "Yeah, that too." Catherine ran up to the porch, her small hands cupped carefully around a captured firefly. "Papa, look! I caught one!" Wade knelt down to her level. "Beautiful. Now what are you going to do with it?" She considered the question seriously, her young face scrunched in concentration. Then she opened her hands, letting the firefly escape back into the summer evening. "It's prettier when it's free," she said simply. Wade glanced at Mabel, who smiled with the knowing look of a mother watching her daughter absorb lessons without realizing it. "That's right, sweetheart," Mabel said. "Some things are only beautiful when they're free to be exactly what they are." Catherine ran back to chase more fireflies, and Wade stood, pulling Mabel close. "You think she'll understand someday?" Mabel asked quietly. "What we went through to get here?" "Maybe. Or maybe she'll just grow up believing that love is supposed to look like this. Messy and real and full of people who refuse to give up on each other." Wade pressed a kiss to her temple. "Either way, she'll know she's wanted. That's more than either of us had." They stood together on the porch, watching their daughter play while the ranch settled into evening quiet. Somewhere in town, people were probably still gossiping about the unlikely couple who'd taken down a senator and built an empire on second chances. Somewhere, the story was being told and retold, each version a little different from the last. But here, on this porch, Wade and Mabel knew the truth that gossip could never capture. That the strongest foundations aren't built on perfection. They're built on two people seeing each other's damage and saying, "I choose this. I choose you," not despite the scars, but because of everything you survived to get them. That love worth having isn't the kind that makes life easier. It's the kind that makes the hard parts worth fighting through. That being chosen, really chosen, completely seen and still wanted, is worth more than all the approval society could offer. And that sometimes, the best things in life start with a desperate knock on a door during a blizzard and a man deciding to open it instead of turning away. Wade had spent 6 years as a ghost, and Mabel had spent months running for her life. But together, they'd found something neither expected: a home, a family, a purpose that went beyond just surviving. They'd found life. And as the Montana stars emerged one by one above Black Hollow Ranch, Wade realized that every moment of pain, every loss, every fear, every frozen year had been worth it to arrive at this moment. Standing on his porch with the woman he loved and the daughter they'd made together, surrounded by a community built on second chances and stubborn hope. The world had tried to tell them both they weren't enough, that they should accept less, want less, be less. They'd proven the world wrong. And that, Wade thought, as Catherine's laughter echoed across the ranch, and Mabel's hand found his in the gathering darkness, was the only victory that had ever really mattered.